Hello and welcome to another episode of the American Soccer Analysis Show. I'm not joined by Harrison. Harrison is all work and no play, making him a dull boy. But I am joined by Ben Benito Suarez Bellman and another guest. It's the offseason. We have lots of guests. Today I'm joined by Matt Pfeffer from Cronky Sports and Entertainment, the Colorado Rapids. And Ben, you and Matt know each other, so I'm gonna just turn it over to you. This is your show. I get to be Ben and Harrison today. So
Mm,
Ben, take us away.
Kieran's in the ride along today. Well, we're really grateful to have Matt. So welcome. Matt is the director of analytics at the Colorado Rapids. I happen to know him, did a little work with him back in the day. We're really grateful to have him on the show. So welcome.
Hey, yeah, thank you.
So I was thinking we would start with your path to data analysis and into the sports world in general, just because everyone's is sort of different. I think yours has a little interesting twist to it. So I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was always obviously interested in sports. I think I definitely from a pretty early age was interested in sort of the mechanics of roster management, something my dad would talk a lot about. And so I was always kind of interested in the just sort of, the transactional nature, I guess, um, how teams are made and how they get better and worse. And yeah, I guess around the time that I was in high school, like Moneyball came out, I had read the book, and that was like, oh, awesome. It was like a great way to kind of get into analytics because I mean, my dad is a computer programmer, so it just seemed like an opportunity for me to kind of use some skills that I had developed onto something that I wanted to do, which was sports. Um, I was born in, well, I was raised in Ottawa. I went to school at Trent in Peterborough. Um, I was really I loved soccer back then, but I mean there wasn't really any potential to work in soccer. I got connected to the local OHL team there, the Peterborough Petes, and that's kind of where my hockey career started. It was pretty natural. Like, I got other jobs after that. Uh, I dropped out of college because I, got a job offer with an NHL team or whatever. Um, I ended up in Nashville where I worked for the Predators for 2 years. And yeah, actually, I had lunch with Eric Parnas, who's one of the analytics guys at the Avalanche. We knew each other from living in Montreal, and he was like, "Oh, there's a job opportunity with the Rapids." I was probably complaining about my job at the time, saying how much it sucked or whatever. And he was like, "Yeah, you should check out this Rapids job." And so I spoke with, I think, Fran Taylor on the phone, and now the sporting director. He obviously came from an analytics background, and I just thought it was great. It just seemed like such a cool opportunity that I immediately was like, wanted to do it and moved to Denver. And yeah, I've been with the club now for 5 years.
Awesome. So how has your role sort of changed within that? So like when you started versus where you are, and like maybe how the club has sort of come along with its analytics journey as well. Unless Kieran, you got something?
No, I think one of the things that I want to highlight because we grew up in similar places. Like Hamilton is not that different from Ottawa. It's maybe a little bit bigger, but it's not that different. Is like I think when I hear or when other people hear like, oh, minor league hockey in Canada, like the minor league hockey teams, the OHL teams are like legitimate professional organizations. Like that was that unique that the Pete's had an analytics person or like because I know lots of teams have them now, but back then was that unique?
Yeah, yeah, no. Almost all teams in the OHL now, I believe, have some form of analytics department. At the time, no, there wasn't. In fact, the sort of development of hockey analytics starts really around, I would say, the late 2010s, but really takes off with sort of the Twitter community that emerges in the early 2010s. Sorry, I meant to say late 2000s previously. Um, and that hockey analytics community was really kind of developing quite quickly. And analytics was not a thing that really existed. I mean, there was sort of a summer of hockey analytics. I think it was 2015 when a bunch of people in the community, including me, got jobs with teams. And that was really the first major opportunity for hockey analytics people, like with teams. And yeah, we had all sort of some people went straight to the NHL, but I got my start sort of in the OHL. Yeah, just doing, stuff I was doing probably wasn't great, but uh yeah, it led to more opportunities.
It's all a journey. So yeah, speaking of which, so like you joined the Rapids in I think 2019. So what did the job look like then? Because like I know as a fan, that was like a couple years after a pretty big, top down overchange with Porig coming in and becoming like club president at that point. So what was that like, and sort of how far have you come since then?
Yeah, Porig's a huge analytics guy too. I think a lot of people who might follow the Rapids or follow MLS analytics in general know about Fran, but Porig himself was very into analytics, and he was super into. He was a big baseball guy back in the day, and he's very knowledgeable about like sabermetrics and those analytics concepts from sort of the 2000s in baseball. Yeah, honestly, I think it was really, it's funny with soccer analytics. I think it's developed a lot. Um, for me personally, I think I tried to sell a vision to Fran about like what I thought we could build. And when you talk about how the job has evolved, really we've been working on that same project now for 5 years. And that's really the totality of it. Like I would say it's not so much a day-to-day job as it is like building a thing, then you're just always working on that thing. And I would say, yeah, the general goal has remained the same the entire time, and we're just trying to build what we set out to build, and it's still not done. One of the
Hmm.
things I we had a scout who just retired this year named Mitch Murray, and he was saying that he visited AC Milan. I think this would have been in the late 2000s. Visited AC Milan on some sort of visit, and they showed him like the software they were building that had certain maybe not, they wouldn't call it analytics, but they did have statistics that they were using. And Mitch was like, when's it going to be done? And the guys there told him like, oh, it's like 10 years away at least, like that's how they thought about what they're building. And I know there's similar programs across Europe. And that's basically what we're building, uh, the same general concept.
Yeah, it's sort of like a system process rather than sort of adapting. It's like here's the vision, and maybe you'll never quite get to the perfect vision, but constantly improving towards it.
I,
Yeah,
I,
yeah,
I guess a question I have, like, one of the, and we're gonna ask you about the tier list and the analytics survey later, so keep that in mind. But like, do you think having someone as bought in, like who comes from the analytical background, like Pareg, do you think that affords like different opportunities for you in your role compared to if you were working for a quote unquote like regular, more orthodox background GM?
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I don't want to make bold statements, but I don't really think it's what we set out to do would be possible in sort of like more generic circumstances, because simply because we haven't delivered much. And really what we are more than anything is sort of an R&D team working on things that without often having much of a final product to show for it. I mean, the stuff we built really wasn't ready until very, very recently in terms of like, you know, actually offering, uh, value to the organization. And what Borig and Fran have done is that they've been very generous with allowing us that sort of runway to be able to build that. Because I think what can happen, and I'm not familiar with what goes on at other MLS teams, but what I could imagine happens in for some analytics people working in soccer is that like they get caught up in the day to day, like producing game reports, like set around like a cycle of deliverables that they're expected to produce, And that could be valuable as well in its own way. But what we've been able to do is to sort of be a little bit more ambitious with what we were trying to build. And yeah, you need buy-in to do that. It's a huge investment from the club. We've now expanded to having 3 members in the analytics department. There's significant investments made both in terms of like the compute and cloud infrastructure, but also just the data. So it's a significant investment, and that's what's required, at least to do what we're trying to do.
It's the compute thing is always funny to me because every time I open up the ASA email, I see the Databricks bill, and I'm like, we're small. So I can only imagine at a club,
Yeah.
like I think people kind of ignore that side of things. That's no, that's very cool to hear.
Mhm. So one question that sort of came up in our Discord, so I sort of pinged around trying to get some ideas for what people were interested in asking. And when I think you might have started to answer this a little, or like hinting at it, but like, Chris Armas comes in and he has a very defined game model. And I think there's a lot of discussion in the popular media about like analytics serving coaching or like coaching players up, like trying to teach them certain concepts. Like you're talking about Moneyball, there's the scene of like Jonah Hill trying to coach up players on like specific stats or what they should specifically be doing to max out the stats they care about. Like how accurate is that? Like, has that happened? Did the job change a little bit when Chris came into the club, or was it sort of locked in on that long-term vision? What the club is doing is sort of already dovetailed with that vision.
Yeah, no, definitely not to the latter. I think we were all really blindsided, I think I can say, by Chris Armas and his coaching staff's like enthusiasm for analytics. And in a lot of ways, it was like troubling for us because it was like kind of just going back to my last answer where it was like, oh, like I'd rather be in the dungeon, like doing my own thing, like I didn't really want to be delivering stuff for the coaching staff just because it wasn't really my wheelhouse. Like I came to soccer from a sort of, I guess I would say, financial thought process. Like what I felt like I could do was beat the market on soccer players. I didn't necessarily think I could do, I didn't think of myself as doing like interesting things at sort of a tactical level or like relevant specifically to the sport of soccer, especially considering I have no bona fides in soccer. I mean, if anything, I come from hockey. But they were just so enthusiastic. And so we started trying to build stuff for them. Just, just to try to, you know, deliver on them because it was rewarding. They were very engaged in what we were trying to do. So yeah, that has been a big part of it. It's something I hope we can continue to build on in the future. Um, it creates another aspect of that is not just in the what we do for the coaching staff at that level, but even in recruitment, it was a very interesting challenge. You talked about the game model. I mean, I don't think that's like a secret to say that like the Rapids are trying to play a specific style of soccer that might accommodate certain characteristics. Um, and, that's kind of annoying for a guy like me because, like, I would much rather um, just pick the players that my model says are good and not have to worry about it. Because for me, it's so much easier when you're doing this stuff to think of players as good or bad. And a lot of people can get mixed up along the way where it's like you can overcomplicate that problem, right? Like you can complicate the problem to death where you can explain away anything to justify uh, notions of what you think that your team needs, right? And so I sort of saw it as a little bit of a potential trap for us, at least in terms of what the analytics were trying to do. Um, but you know, when you have a system like this, it requires certain types of players, and not anyone will do. So what we did was we went and tried to engineer, reverse engineer the characteristics that the coaching staff would require for their style of soccer, and tried to deliver players both in terms of how good or bad they are, or more specifically, how over underrated we think they are, because that's what really matters. And also the degree to which they were suitable for our specific needs. So that was the first time we ever took on a challenge like that, and that's I think we've done that to some degree. We're trying to do that, at least I would say.
I think the point about relating the game model, but also the coach's enthusiasm about analytics is really crucial. Like we talked to Nikos last week, and like Nikos is approaching things from a super high level like director of recruitment standpoint, and like when you have recruitment people who know the data and also know what the data means, and then you have analytics staff who are putting the data together, but then you have coaches who are like, hey, you're telling me this player is good because they have this data supporting it. And the recruitment staff are saying, hey, we understand the data, we see the video as well. This player is good. It becomes so much easier where I imagine you had conversations where you're reverse engineering the criteria they need, like you said, where you're having conversations and like they actually know, like if you say, oh, they have to play for a team with a this PPDA, they know what PPDA is. You can have a real conversation about that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, it's great. I mean, I'm thrilled with the way it's going. I think yeah, it's an exciting time in the organization, definitely.
For sure. So while we're on the topic of like the rosters, and you brought up Nikos, Kieran, one of the things we really talked about last week was like the roster rules and the new changes, and it like sort of a freeing up of the internal market in a few different ways. You know, with like more GAM, the 2DP versus 3DP model, and now the cash trades and all that. So you talked about like coming at this from a financial mindset, like maybe based on your answers, it's not changing your day-to-day job too much, but like how are these rule changes affecting how you think about the players, or like how the numbers might contribute in terms of like the new financial mechanisms or the new ways to exploit, not exploit the system, but use the system in advantageous ways.
Definitely exploit the system.
Yeah,
It's not exploiting
yeah,
if it's in the rules though.
yeah. It's really interesting. I mean, the MLS is one of the most fascinating leagues from a roster construction standpoint, I would say. Like there's endless amounts of things to learn. I learn new things still all the time. And of course it's changing all the time too, which makes it a very, very interesting market. And you have a sort of an incongruous set of sort of incentive structures, which really creates, if you think about something like a financial asset in the liquid market, like there's just how much it's worth, right? And then in the MLS, you have all these different categories, which sort of complicate the problem further. And it's a really interesting, and in a sense, is when you say exploit, I mean, it's true. It's a way to capture value in the same way that you might find an underrated player, you might find an underrated um, a part of the sort of superstructure of MLS cap rules that is exploitable, that could produce surplus value. So we have to try to do that. I think that is something the Rapids have tried to do. Is to try to not just know players and how good they are, but to know the market and the cap specifically. Um, in terms of how it affects me, I would say an example of something I would say would be like the following is like the U22 initiative stuff, right? Um, that kind of sucks for analytics guys. I mean, really, because like I would, I think the more minutes you have, the more confidence you have. And so oftentimes the guys I have the best feelings about from an analytics point of view are certainly not going to be U22 players where they may not have played a lot of minutes. I may not have a lot to say about players like that. And I think that's an area where sort of scouting and analytics are just interacting, right? Because it's like there's only so much we can do with limited data. So yeah, that's an example of something that's annoying, right?
Hmm.
I would love to be incentivized to get older players because we could probably in the aggregate make smarter bets about older players. But we're incentivized you have to utilize those slots from a cap efficiency point of view. So yeah, I guess that would be an example. In terms of the
Hmm.
freeing up, I would say in general, I can't speak for the Rapids, but it does seem as though the ability to sort of trade using cash would be a disadvantage to teams that produce GAM surplus. And that is something that I know we try to do. Every team tries to do, but us a lot. Um, so yeah, I do think there will be limitations to it in the sense that, of course, you still have to take the cash as a charge on your GAM, which means that it really, I think, will only make sense for DP players or players that you would plan to make DPs. So, you know, um, hey, it's
Yeah,
always good when the quality of the league goes up for
for
the league.
sure.
So,
So
I'm happy about it in that sense.
I'm curious because like it's I feel like every time we podcast the rules change and like coming up from the
Seriously, this year,
yes,
seriously.
seriously, we did a whole rules episode and a week later they changed the entire transfer market. But like you came from the NHL in an era where financially the NHL like wasn't doing super strong and it was like flat cap for most of your time, right? And not like the NHL doesn't have DPs and they don't have like you have the for people who don't follow hockey that closely, like the thing I see the most from the outside is like them managing who is on the roster to the day to get within dollars of the cap. Going from a place where like the rules are very well defined, you know, with a high degree of certainty exactly what the financial constraints next year are going to be, to this chaotic mess of changing financial rules. How has that change been for you?
Yeah, it's interesting. The MLS is really at the intersection of this sort of cartel-based North American sports league format. I don't mean cartel in a disparaging way. I mean in the economic sense. Uh, Interacting with this global market for super players in which they don't have a hegemonic place in it in the way that sort of the rest of the major North American sports leagues do. And so what you have is these efforts to sort of coerce, or I should say, to use the monopolistic power of the league to protect costs, uh, sort of butting up against this internationalized market, and it creates a very interesting kind of situation that's constantly evolving as the league's place in the global soccer market evolves with it. And I think one thing that um, one thing that I think as an MLS team that's sort of challenging is like the league's getting better really fast. So like um that's a lot of what these mechanisms are doing is they're pumping good soccer players into the league. And so like that's tough because what you don't have in that North American sports league structure is this sort of safety net that exists pushing you back towards the median, whether you're good or bad. So that's sort of what I would say is that the structure of the North American major sports league is centered around this sort of these regressive effects that serve to push the good teams down and the bad teams up. That doesn't exist in the MLS. However, we still have these other mechanisms um, of a North American sports league. So, yeah, it can be quite challenging to sort of know how to produce surplus value or to how I should say specifically how to strategize producing surplus value in a marketplace that's constantly evolving. There have been times where and I think of specific times during the time that I've been at the Rapids where what we thought would be a good or bad deal turned out to not be a good or bad deal, not because we were wrong about the conditions, but rather that the conditions changed in regards to specific players' value in the overall marketplace for players in the MLS. So yeah, it's hard to make predictions about the future if you don't know what what the conditions will be in the future and how they may change.
I had somebody from a club tell me when the U22 rule came in. One of the first U22 signings, they were like, this guy's good, or he will be good in a few years, but they will be better faster than he gets good enough faster. And they're like, he will never end up being good enough for them because the league will be
Yeah.
better before he is better, which I thought was a really interesting thing. And it is like we do see that. And unless we see it with academy kids all the time, where like you think, oh, where this team is now in 2, 3 years, they'll be really useful. And in 2, 3 years, the team is gone and they're good enough for what they were 3 years ago, but they're not now.
Yeah, the league's getting so good so fast. It's crazy. I mean, we have measurements of league rating and it's just like it's just getting so the trajectory has been great. Good for the league. Expensive, but like, good, I guess.
So I'm
The
curious before we leave the hockey world forever, I'm curious if there's any lessons that you think either sport could learn from each other. Like I know one thing you've talked about before is hockey analytics is easier just because there's so many more shots, there's so much more volume of actions within a game. Are there things that hockey does that soccer analysts could learn from or vice versa?
Yeah, one of the great I feel very grateful to have been part of the hockey analytics community because it really did have a rare set of circumstances around it that made the development of that community flourish in the way that it did. Specifically, the availability of public data. The fact that the people working on doing stuff on Twitter and stuff like that on blogs had essentially the same data that was available to NHL teams. Like um, that has just made a huge difference. And that's something that does not exist in soccer. If you want to work with good data, you have to be working for a team. And that makes the development of a public analytics community more difficult and also more fragmented too. Like a good example of this would be American soccer analysis, where you guys are doing specific stuff on the MLS because those are the data that's the data that you're working with and so on. It's not directly transferable to what someone who covers the Premier League might have in terms of data and so on. So it just fragments things. Um, of course, you guys, and then I sort of have a joke with my guys about the soccer analytics community. It's like everybody like sending papers to each other about like their own open play model. And it's like, yeah, everyone has one. Like, I'm sure yours is good. Mine's good. Like they're all good. They're all different, but like, and we all have different terminology and names for all of it, so that makes it more sort of challenging. Um, and I think in regards to hockey, you know, it is specifically analytics, you mean?
yeah,
Yeah.
like
Yeah, specifically analytics.
Sorry, go ahead.
I
Go
mean, like
for it, Kieran.
we've been talking recently, like something came up the other day about I was looking at Money Puck and I was like looking at how they use non-rebound XG as part of their model. And I was like, hey, I know we have X rebound, like we handle it a certain way. Like, what does our XG, what does our team strength model look like if we just ignore rebounds? And it's like, it's one of those weird things where, as different as the two sports are, like there is a lot of borrowing in the history of soccer analytics from hockey analytics. And I'm curious if you see much of that now. And if there's things that you're like, obviously, if you take stuff, you're not going to tell us, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would say the thing that makes hockey the sort of uber sports for analytics outside of baseball, I would say, would be the fact that you can reverse engineer team level results into sort of player effects, measurements of how the players are affecting these team level results. And that's made possible through the variety of combinations of players that are on the ice um, at different times, which means you can separate teammates, you can separate opposition. And so and that's sort of another, sorry, I don't want to give jokes, but like another sort of joke about hockey analytics is like the real meat of the issue for the people that were doing hockey analytics back then was like how to extract specific effects of the players on the ice from the team level results. And that's like, the same thing like ghouls at Amazon are doing to like measure the efficiency of warehouse workers. Like it has nothing to do with hockey, right? It's not a hockey question. Um, and that's kind of just like what I think a lot of people think about soccer analytics in the same way, where it's like, oh, you're working on soccer all the time. And it's like, no, I'm working on like incredibly niche measurements of things where like the only other research on this is like in some other field in industry or something like that. You know, I mean, the problems are statistical at that level more than they are to do with like soccer per se. Um, what I was going to say is obviously being reverse engineering team effects for or sorry, team results using player effects is not tenable in soccer in the same way that it is in hockey, which means you have to approach soccer literally. That is to say, literally looking at what the players are doing, and that's a very dangerous thing because you've divorced yourself from the axis of the sport itself. That is to say, the nice thing about measuring team results is that you're very confident that like the teams are trying their best to accomplish the things that you're measuring them on. Whereas in soccer, or sorry, in soccer, when you're looking at the level of players, you do not have that same benefit. In other words, that your means of measuring the players maps onto their objectives, either as they perceive of it, as their coaches conceive of it, or like just literally like how they are affecting play. Um, Once you reach that barrier and you're now looking at the level of the player and trying to say, okay, well, how is this player affecting results? You don't have a sort of contextual anchor to base yourself around, right? And so that creates like a situation where there's no resolvable truth, right? You can say a player does this thing, but how that relates either in regards to his specifically doing that thing or how he generally affects play in ways that you may not be able to measure. um, all of these complications arise. So it's really a different arena. um, the development of hockey, you have stat providers now that are doing that level of statistics, and so, but they're obviously only available to NHL teams, Sports Logic and InStat and so on. They now have player level stats, and I would offer the same kind of warning is that a lot of people think of these types of stats as an extension of the stats that exist in, say, basketball. Basketball is an example. I hope I'm not talking too much here, guys. But basketball is an example where there was a very mature and developed set of statistics pre-analytics, right? And so, um, what I would caution against in soccer analytics is the sort of philosophy that said, well, let's just do that for soccer, right? Let's create these arbitrary um, categorizations of play, whatever that
Mm-hmm.
may mean, and sort of um, assign value based on our feelings about those specific categories of play that we've decided have some inherent value or whatever. It's a dangerous area to be swimming in, you know.
We see this all the time with possession value stuff, right, Ben? Like we've talked so
Mm-hmm.
much about like, oh, this player passed backwards,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a negative possession value or G plus action, even though their goal is to either help their team score more or stop their team from conceding or whatever. Like I remember when we first put out G plus, Gary Gillade, who was like the first guy to make an analytics department in the Premier League, was like, oh, it's so clever to think to assign that if you reduce your chance of conceding on the next possession, you are achieving the same goal as trying to score. Like obviously players think that way. And it's like, yeah, of course, but it's very, very difficult in soccer where like actually you can do 30 actions that are not directly directed towards your immediate goals, but are in your brain helping you achieve them. It's a very, very difficult problem.
Yeah. Or
Yeah,
even
yeah.
or even the idea of like basketball, like plus minus, like you sub someone and you sub someone out, like what's the score differential? Like I think that's for a while people were trying to do that with soccer, completely ignoring the fact that you can't sub back in once you sub out. Like the sub regime is a completely different, and it's the same in hockey. Like you have to look at it from a completely different perspective. Like the same statistics, like there's no value there in a
Because we did
completely different
Wowie.
sport.
That's we did Wow. Chu Kai Ho did Wowie like in 2016 or 2017, and the
Hmm.
takeaway was like this doesn't tell you anything.
Yeah.
Yes, that was something that existed in basketball as well, as people tried to do that type of thing. Basically, what I defined it earlier as like player effects derived from team results, right? And I suppose it is possible in very large sample sizes, like if you're trying to settle like sort of Hall of Fame type debates about basketball. Um, it's possible. There's interesting things to say, but you just never would get a realistic sample size, certainly within the MLS or anything to do anything like that. Yeah, and just jump on what you guys were saying about the goals plus stuff. I think that is sort of the answer, right? Is and this is what all sports ultimately with tracking are doing is they're converging in their form. That is to say, they're probabilistically evaluating individual moments and then measuring the delta between them. I mean, that's literally what exists in the NFL, the NBA as well, in all these sports, because that's sort of like the I don't know the atoms of sport is like
Hmm. The absolute
measuring
unit,
the
you might say.
yeah, exactly, is measuring the probabilities that exist in whatever the game is and whatever the sort of way to score is, and measuring it through time, and then trying to assign credit to players, right? Both good and bad. And the thing about that is like, this goes back to another thing I said is like everyone's trying to do that, right? And how you do that is the big question. I would say in soccer is the most frustrating by far to try to develop these types of models because in soccer very little sort of happens. So for example, you guys brought up the pass back to the goalkeeper, right? Um, that happens every game. How does that affect the chances that either team score? Like not at all. Like not literally not at all. Or like because there's so few goals, um, the volatility, in other words, the change in time of goal probability is is incredibly small. And then when goal chances occur, they're incredibly big and volatile swings in goal probability. So the what you're most interested in is that moment from nothing at all to these huge chances. But if you try to capture the value that's created and destroyed in these enormous chance creating moments in a soccer game, you're left with actually very little, even over the course of a season to really measure.
Hmm.
Um, it's just a simple fact that like there's not that much to measure in a soccer game.
Yeah.
The real impact level plays, they're relatively infrequent, and even when you do get them, the circumstances around them, even with tracking, can be very difficult to judge correctly. Very, yeah, incredibly hard sport
Yeah.
to try to
I
do analytics for.
I think I was looking at this one time, the median absolute value of an action by G plus. So like all of the actions, positive, negative, median, absolute value of those, the median is like less than a quarter of a percent.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Or
100%.
Like
even
it's just almost everything you do doesn't
Yeah,
matter.
and even
Correct.
that
Yeah.
the big moments you're talking about, like I remember looking at some animations of Luke Bourne and Javier Hernandez paper that was, using some European League tracking data to like in the moment, like as the players are moving around the screen, here's the pitch control changing, here's like like a momentum tracker of like what's the positive or negative chance of scoring. And like one of those big moments where you're like looking at the screen, I'm like, they should score here. I think the probability of it being a goal is like zero point 0.1, like a tenth, one goal out of 10 in a game state on a soccer field chessboard isn't it's enormous. That's an enormous opportunity in soccer because normally it's 0.01 or less. So
Yes.
it's a
And
tough
and
sport.
and speaking of those moments that you're describing, they're the toughest to judge with the data that we have.
Because
One of
they're
the
the
things
rarest moments, I'm sure.
yeah, that's part of it. But the other thing is that the distances collapse in these important moments in terms of like our ability to precisely measure a player's true control of the ball is we very, very little with the data that we have available, very little insight into that. So, for example, if you're using event data, which you guys do as well, you'll know you have to decide what a touch constitutes, let's say, in the box. So if a guy gets on the end of a ball in the opposition box and immediately loses it, he's destroyed a ton of value, right? But you don't know how fair that is because you don't really are, you're not properly able to assess
Hmm.
the true amount of possession that the player had. If the ball whizzes by his feet and instead of sticking a leg out and grabbing it for a millisecond. Instead of that, it goes past him and he never touches it. Then there's no event at all for that. And he gets away completely scot free, right?
Yep. This
So
is,
like
yep.
it's the precision of the measurement is so key here. And it's that's why I would say I know that the MLS tracking provider is experimenting with body pose data, which is something that came to the NBA quite recently. I think that could be a major development. Um, and I think in general, if there's any sort of event data providers out there, I would highly suggest a sort of more concerted effort to better define sort of the true nature of possession that players have when they get these sort of like game possession type events.
It's so
And then
funny. That's exactly what I was going to ask you was like, because we've like Ted Knutson has said about the StatsBomb data that a huge part of why their XG model is so much better than everybody else's is that, or at least from the providers who are publicly available, is that they have much better granularity in the box. Like they're measuring in point 0.1 yards, not 1 yards, where like we see in the box, like the ball can move half a yard one way or the other, and that wildly changes the value of the chance. And then like Elliot did a great article a long time ago, but like how real is that movement in the box? But I am curious, like, is the body pose is and not just body pose, but also like the biomechanics stuff. Like we're seeing a lot more focus on that now. MLSE just hired uh or put out, I don't know if they actually hired anybody, contractors for biomechanics analytic stuff. Like, is that something that interests you, something you see being a big part of the future?
it's interesting. Yeah, to be honest, it's not something I know a lot about. I think as we reach the levels of sort of the limits of our ability of our precision in regards to this goal value stuff we're talking about, I think it becomes necessary. Um, but there's another part of me that sort of also yearns for that sort of I believe that data provider, was it Brentford or Brighton? Um, there's an analytics company that's doing like
I think that's
these
Brighton.
yeah, subjective um evaluations. And quite frankly, I have a feeling that like these subjective evaluations of player actions are just better. And it would take quite a lot for the analytics to get good enough to really compete.
Well, that's what
So
we saw with big chances, right? Like big chances have
yeah,
XG models. The big chances have always been better than models without them because there is something about like I am watching this. The player has rounded the goalkeeper or whatever it is. Like I can see that he or she is off balance or has taken a good first touch or the recovering defender is going to overcommit or whatever it is. There's something that you can see that like, oh, I think this chance is much better than the raw X, Y velocity sorts of things that fit into it.
yes. I think the natural, not an expert, but the natural human's ability, anyone who's a fan of soccer can watch a soccer game and have a much better intuitive sense of the true things like the true danger of a chance, that the value of a player action than the most sophisticated X sorry G plus models that exist in the world today can. I think now that doesn't mean that they might be able to convert that into actual probabilities, right? Famously, if you ask anyone what are the chances this shot goes in, they'll all tell you 100%, right? Even though they had true answers, I don't know, obviously much lower, right? But their intuitive sense is more refined than a model's ever could be. And so I think what where the real benefit potentially could come from in the near term with these types of models is not so much greater precision, although of course I think that's key. We're always trying to get more precision. The other facet of this precision talk that we're talking about as well is attribution, right? So our ability to attribute value is not so sophisticated either and could be much better. When I say us, I'm talking about, you guys, anyone who's
Yeah,
building a
that's something
comprehensive
we
open
argue
value.
about all the time is attribution.
Well, it's so Matt, it's funny you bring this up. We had so ASA keeps everything in Slack, and we eventually like things get lost to Slackrot because we're a little baby and we don't pay for a Slack Pro. So we like pulled up an old thing, and Total Football was looking for the original, the very first G plus list that ever came out. When we first built the model. And the first list that came out was awful. None of the players were good. Messi was like negative. Like it was a disaster. And then somewhere along the way, we got to a point where we did pass allocation between passer and receiver. And the first list that came out between passer and receiver in this attribution problem was the best list we had ever seen. It was like the first soccer possession value list that was like Messi, Ronaldo, Mbappe, Kevin De Bruyne, all the best players, and then like one weird player. And it was like the Bill James rule about the one weird outlier. And it's so funny because everything comes back to, and every time there's things we hate about the model and there's things we hate about other things, it's like, how do you split up the fact that these players are doing things together and who you give the credit to?
Yes, and also consider that the error around your ability to evaluate the situation probabilistically is compounded by this problem in very interesting ways. So, for example, one thing I'm aware of is certain types of these models tend to really overrate particular types of tens, particular types of nines that come into space, receive the ball with a lot of time around them, the ability to do things. That kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is that the our models are most precise when players have the most time and space. So, like, I can think of a center back that we had a couple of years ago, Danny Wilson, right? Who just beautiful left foot, like pinged balls, just with spray passes, and was a really, really excellent guy on the ball. It's so easy to evaluate him. He's like a quarterback back there, right? He's lining it up, he's pinging it forward, and it's like very, very simple conditions around the pass. You got this passer, he gets to pick his target, he hits the target or he doesn't hit the target, and so on. But then when space contracts further up the field, um, now your ability to define the true probability is both more volatile in absolute terms, but also um, more um, more easily manipulated by the specific circumstances that you may not be able to track with the data that you have, if that makes sense. And so it's what can happen, in other words, is that you start to reward certain types of actions over others because you're not properly um, attributing this error that's being produced by the lack of precision, if that makes sense.
Well, we've got you for a few more minutes, and so we were hoping we could pick your brain on some ASA stuff. So I'm sure you've read the analytics tiers and our the MLS analyst survey. What do you make of those things? Like, do you think those help in the discussion internally? Like, do you like seeing the rapids at the top of the analytics tiers? Like, what does that do out in the secret in internal world that we can't really see that well?
Yeah, it certainly is an honor. Yeah, I mean, I obviously take a lot of pride in what me and my team have been able to build. I certainly think the real credit has to go to the people that created the conditions for this analytics department. Um, Porig and Fran. And then also, I think it's worth shouting out the guys at Arsenal who we collaborate with a little bit. They too are super into analytics. They have a very robust department there, and we've been collaborating with them for a while now. And I feel like it's just a really great place to work, really interesting place to be able to build stuff. Um, in terms of the stuff, I mean, it's crazy how quickly it's developing. Like there's just more people hired every year. I do think that um, I think that I think there's a lot of analytics people who are more focused on like the first team and the tactics and stuff like that. I think that's something that we could definitely get better at, kind of like I was describing earlier. I've had the opportunity to talk to some of the analytics people like at conferences and stuff, and like they're all so nice. They're all so much nicer than me too, because like I'm sort of like I think I'm better. I think I'm smarter than everybody. And it's like you go to a conference because I know this from hockey. I don't want to say anything bad about people in hockey, okay? But I went to hockey analytics conferences and every guy there thinks he's like the smartest guy in the world, right? And like everyone else is stupid. Like that's the community I came from. Great community, but like that is just like everyone else thinks that everyone is stupid. And then I know the MLS analytics guys are like so nice, not guys and girls are like so nice, so like humble and down to earth that it actually made me like modify my behavior a little bit where it's like, oh, I look like a total like, you know, uh, you know, loser.
Nice.
You jerk. Yeah,
Yeah,
loser.
because it's sort of an affect. It's as an analytics guy, I think, maybe this was just in hockey, but I think there's a certain affect that you take on where it's like, I'm a genius and everybody knows it because I'm like doing all the coding and stuff like that. And that's just like how I am, I think. And most of the MLS people are not like that. So yeah, that's pretty cool. Um,
I do think
sorry.
I think that's a hockey that's not just a hockey analytics thing though. I think that's a hockey thing. Like to survive with like some pretty rugged characters, like I think you have to be a shark. Like I think that is very much part of it.
Yeah, potentially. I think a lot of us came from the other thing about hockey, which makes it interesting, is so many of us came from situations where we just hated our NHL team so much that we like got into it through that. I know the city of Edmonton has one of the most impressive records of analytics people. Like a lot of the top guys came from Edmonton and they all circulated around these same blogs where they were just driven by this hatred of management that was like so powerful that it compelled all of these guys to start doing their own research, which eventually evolved into like a full-on analytics movement in hockey. Like I'm not exaggerating. Like those Oilers fan blogs and Leafs fan blogs were like the genesis of much of what hockey analytics exists today. So they start as like spiteful, hateful people. That's like how you get into analytics for a lot of us. I mean, I certainly feel that way a little bit about the Senators.
I'm pretty sure the what was the Cap website that just got bought and like closed down semi recently?
Yes, cap friendly, or that might have been a
Yeah, I'm
previous.
pretty sure they were Capitals guys or Penguins guys who were like, we hate this team so
Yeah,
much.
yeah. Hockey again. I don't want to say anything bad about hockey, but like the ambient level of market efficiency in hockey is like I'll just say staggering, such that like you can be a pretty normal person and like um, find yourself taking an incredible amount of umbrage at what your team is doing just because it just doesn't make any sense. And then you do more research and you find out, oh, it really doesn't make any more sense. Like it's incredibly frustrating to be a hockey fan or an informed hockey fan because um, the level of efficiency. Like, what one example? Sorry, I hope I'm not talking too much here, guys. Like
I'll go for it.
being a Blue Jays fan as I am, is like kind of annoying now
Oh
because it's
God,
like
here we go. We're gonna be here a long time.
I just find it kind of annoying because it's like, well, these guys probably know what they're doing. I don't know enough to like dispute it. Whatever it is, in other words, like you know that if you're a fan of a baseball team, like unless you're a fan of like the Colorado Rockies, or maybe I shouldn't say that, but like unless you're a fan of
I'd
unless
like
you're a
to
fan of like
apologize.
one of unless you're a fan of like one of a few number of teams, you can basically be pretty sure that like the team's being run as effectively as it can be, like with its resources and assets as it currently has. Whereas in hockey, it's just simply not the case at all, you know. So generally,
And I think
not all
to
teams.
steer us back to soccer, I think that's very true about soccer as well, where like a lot of like we've seen in Toyota Football and John Muller's like their podcasts, like Postscript, the soccer analytics background story, like the very first soccer blogs are all people being like, my team keeps losing. I hate this. Why? Or like I think in one case it's like we're winning and I don't think we're that good, which is quite rare. Um, I guess one of the things I'm curious about is like we hear a lot from clubs and from other people, particularly like one person departments, that they like being low on the tier list because then they can go to management and be like, I need more help. And management or ownership are like embarrassed that they're at the bottom of the list. When you are one of the top teams, where like in the survey, you're a top five team, you are in tier zero of the tier list, is there, I don't know how much you interact with ownership, but is there a certain amount of like, yeah, we're good at this, and that buys you more cachet?
Yeah, I would say it does apply pressure on us. I feel as though I mean no one has explicitly told me this, but I mean the Rapids have invested a lot into analytics. And it does put pressure on us to sort of produce a return on that. That's certainly the way I think about it. I wouldn't say that anyone's told me that explicitly, but we do appreciate that we're a sizable part of the team's sort of strategy, and we try to take that pretty seriously. I think, I can remember when I was working for the Nashville Predators, and like my greatest ambition was like being able to invite like an undrafted guy in the WHL to like training camp or whatever, like um here at the Rapids, like it's it's a significant enough investment into it that I think we there's an expectation that we do produce value for the club. Um, and that's a lot of pressure, but it's also an exciting challenge. Um, yeah, I think for those teams that are just starting out on sort of their journey to building an analytics department and so on, there's less pressure, which can be good, but it can also, I would say it's incredibly motivating to come to work and think like, oh man, like I can actually make a difference here and management does expect something of me. Whereas I think again, speaking to my own past experiences working as an analytics guy, you can sometimes end up being a little bit of like a sort of afterthought or almost a necessity in the sense that like, oh, well, teams need an analytics guy, so let's go get an analytics guy. But if you're not necessarily integrated into the decision making structure of the club, you may find it hard to exert influence, and that really just comes at the level of management.
But before we let you go, I want to hit you with one more question, and this is easily the most requested we've had from our network of people I've pinged out. Is finishing real?
Yes, finishing is real, but that doesn't mean you can measure it. It's kind of
Oh,
like
that's my favorite answer.
Yes, this is what we're here for.
like another good one is goalkeepers. I was speaking to someone at the Rapids, part of the Rapids media. So someone who covers the Rapids was asking me about like goalkeepers and stuff. And I was like, oh, I don't know. Like, yeah, I don't know. Sure, whatever. Like these measurements we have for goalkeepers, according to the tests that we've run, would take years of data to get some sort of like predictivity out of. And you don't get that. It just doesn't exist. Like you go look at the split samples of something like goals saved above expected or so on for like goalkeepers in Europe, and like how many of them are consistently above. I think essentially like none. Some are above in rather large sample sizes, but like not significantly. And to the degree that they are, like the regression of the mean seems very, very, very powerful. So what I would say is that that doesn't mean that goalkeeping is not real, but it means that there may be limits to like your ability to measure it, considering the constraints of things like time, and sample size and so on. Um,
It,
I
the
Sorry, go
goalkeeper,
ahead.
no, the goalkeeper one is like great. Like Mike and Bergio and I did the Bays thing looking at Georgi Petrovic because he was like ridiculous XG numbers and Chelsea were probably going to buy him. So it was like, this is weird to look at. And like, if you are a 99.999th percentile goalkeeper, it still takes a season and a half to be 95% confident that you're just above average.
Yes.
So
Yes.
and for anything I think below 65th percentile, it was more shots than you would face in your career. Like
Yes.
it's
Yes.
immensely difficult.
In soccer, so many shots are so. This is I brought something up earlier, which I didn't feel like I expressed as much as I wanted to, but it's sort of related to this, which is that uncertainty compounds. So, um, what you have is a situation where your ability to measure, let's call it the true XG of the shot, is limited in itself. Your ability to measure the true post-shot XG of itself is limited. But what happens when you have limited accuracy is regression to the mean of the measurement. And that's a very important point when it comes to things like finishing and goalkeeping, is that the uncertainty associated with those are not all attributable to player skill. They're also attributable to your lack of precision in the data. And so that uncertainty gets shifted towards the mean. And so what you have if you try to create statistics that's based on this type of stuff is that um, if I could just draw out an example, right? The vast majority of let's say perhaps this isn't quite the case, but the vast majority of shots are either basically going to go in or not go in, and that the player's skill doesn't have too much to do with it, either the skill of the shooter or the goalkeeper. And then there's some smaller percentage of shots in which the goalkeeper has like a lot to do with it. Perhaps you could say a good goalkeeper would save this shot and a bad goalkeeper would not save this shot. Now, if we're talking about MLS goalkeepers, that's not a lot of shots, right? But the thing is that that's not actually what happens. In fact, the worst MLS goalie in the league could make an incredible save on any given save. And the same is true, the vice versa is true. The best goalkeeper in the league could save a shot that, otherwise would be quite savable most of the time or so on. And so what if you take that small segment of shots in which there's a lot of leverage exerted by the people involved, um, the uncertainty there may be determined by the shooter or the goalkeeper, but that's lumped in with a whole lot of uncertainty outside of the effects of the shooter and the goalkeeper as well, which means that the whole situation gets incredibly volatile, and it's just hard to come up with measurements that where you're going to be able to extract a lot of predictivity.
Hmm. Yeah, the repeatability thing is always what comes up in our conversations. I would say in the Slack is like you talked about earlier about like the bad touch in the box. Like, is it just because it was a bad pass that bounced off their foot or something like there's so much volatility in the value gained or lost that could have just been
Yeah.
random chance or not like. So at one point I think we did this experiment where we just like we looked at G plus but ditched all turnovers or ditched all missed touches, and the predictability of those increased. Like, so we're
Yeah,
not sure
sure.
if it was like accurate. Like, are we saying
No,
they're good or are we
you
saying
should
they're
do
bad?
that.
But yeah, but like that's definitely something that I've thought a lot about. Is like, how do you reduce the noise when you're dealing with this data that has so much context that you actually can't observe and can't measure? How do you get rid of as much uncertainty as you can within that framework?
A way of thinking about it is like if if you took all of your G plus events and you took the negative ones, the truth is that of the negative ones, your probabilities on average were too high. And for your positive G plus events, your expected probabilities for those events were too low. And the same is true of shots in the sense that if a guy scores from an XG of zero point 0.3, chances are that the true, quote unquote, true XG of that shot was higher than zero point 0.3 and vice versa.
It's so I love when we get into these conversations because it gets real into like the sicko weeds very, very
Oh,
quickly.
so fast.
Uh, it's I think one of the really difficult things is like we've seen lots of other possession value models just like eschew negative events because they're like it actually ruins a lot of the things you're trying to take away. Like I think Paul Harvey, who dropped a really, really cool piece about cohesion recently, and past differentials and stuff that's really good. You should go check it out if you haven't read it yet. But he brought up one time that if an average player in MLS gives away a penalty, it takes them like 10 games of above average play to get back to zero. And so if you're looking at like these huge, very rare events, like an underhit back pass that somebody runs onto, or a horrible touch in the box, or a given away penalty, or a red card, it's really, really difficult to make up for that. But it's also really difficult to be like, well, like this guy's a bad player, or this girl's a bad player because of that moment when everything else is there. It's a really, really difficult dilemma.
Yeah, I think, sorry, and I tell me if I'm going too long here, guys. I feel bad talking too much, but I do
Matt,
love
we'll
talking about this
talk
stuff.
for 2 hours if you want to stay
Yeah.
for 2 hours.
Okay.
People will listen.
I did want to say, like, I think one thing people can do, which might be a mistake, is conflate a player's value that he produces to how good he is. And I think you have to think of those as two separate things in the sense that the player value created is obviously the goal, but that doesn't mean that previous value created is the best way to measure future value created. And that some types of events might be more predictive than other types of events in terms of producing future value. In other words, there's some events that are just um, like their predictive value is not quite worth what their value in wins are. You know what I mean? Um, I think one, I don't want to give away too much of my own. Sorry, I have a
No
lot of
worries.
things along these lines, but like one thing I would say is that you can treat these like the financial market is an interesting way of thinking about it, which is that you can measure the volatility of a stock, right? And the underlying volatility is baked into the sort of price of derivatives, you know. And I think people could stand to think about soccer actions in the same way that you can in fact measure the volatility of the given situation and you can price that in, you know, to help try to standardize these things a little bit.
That's I think the volatility and variance piece is a really fun thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately, where like we've spoken on this podcast at length about how there's two different kinds of variance, right? Like there is variance in a team plays a 2xg to a 1xg game. What is the possible result distributions of that xg performance? But also, if you say that team is on average a 2xg to 1xg team, what is the distribution of performances around that mean? So you get like a double variance effect. It's that I think is a thing that is very, very often missed. And the same thing on the player side, right? Where like there are players that will pop up in the data and their mean is very high, but it could be very feast or famine. Like this was a thing, and I don't comment on this, but like Chicho Arango, Ben, that we've talked about. Chicho Arango had huge numbers last year, but it's like 1.9 XG in a game here, and then like point 0.1, point 0.1, point 0.1, point 0.1. And so it's huge. And on the financial side, like you see this in transfers, right? Like where the value of a player in their transfer is entirely divorced from their ability as a player, where Lionel Messi joins Inter Miami for $0. Like that is that Miami, he's still one of the best players in the world. Like there is a tremendous amount of weirdness around the fact that transfer fees are not have nothing to do with quality. They're the fee to break a contract to join your team. It's a very, very different instrument.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the so much of the value of soccer players is tied up in their speculative value as assets. And so I think what as the amount of money that's come into the league has risen, a lot of what teams are paying for, and some of the incentive structures around that are um, oriented around um, investing in the speculative value of players, as opposed to their hypothetical value to teams like on the field. And what that has, it's sort of the macro level, is it just inflates the asset prices for these players and reduces their quote unquote yields, right? In bond terms. In other words, the more speculators enter the market, the more they drive up the price and the lower their ultimate returns are going to be. That is to say, if they can in fact compete on their ability to extract returns on these players. The MLS is a very, very good league in terms of the overall quality of the league. And so the prospect of a U22 player coming to this league and being too good for this league is like harder and harder. In other words, like it's becoming harder to imagine that. And if a player is U22 and could be a good player in this league, then he's also a very potentially attractive prospect to anyone, including it at the highest levels of Europe. You know, so yeah, so I guess this sort of derailed. I derailed what we were talking about, but I did just want to throw that in there, which is that like, I think teams not teams, but when fans think about these players and what their quote unquote value is, right? There's sort of the intrinsic value of them as soccer players, but there's also this sort of parallel revenue creation mechanism that exists in soccer, which it does exist in North American sports, but like on the fringes. That is to say, your ability to speculate on players' values, simply because in a sport like baseball or any other North American sport, a player's trade value is roughly equivalent in the aggregate to, how many wins in theory he'll produce on for you. In other words, his value as an asset is directly transferable into the sort of free agent market for wins. In soccer, there's this whole other level in which teams are, in theory, better able to extract the value out of the player than you are, which means he has to transfer teams simply to produce more value. In other words, to accomplish the overall efficiency of the market. So, yeah, transfer fees and stuff. People quote transfer fees like on transfer market and stuff, and it's like just not. It's not a real thing.
Well, and not only the last point of like, do they have to transfer them to extract more value? Teams will play players who have negative win value
Yes.
because their value in the alternative, the parallel market you mentioned is so large, or their potential future win value is so large that they can extract value there, which is, and we've said extract value and markets enough that like the Discord's going to be popping when this comes out, which will
It's
Belong on
be.
it's
NPR at this
it's a
point.
real shame because it contributes to the sort of minor legalization of global soccer, which I think is happening, which is that teams' abilities to extract what I would sort of say are productive revenues, that is to say, non-rentier revenue. In other words, the money they can extract by having a good soccer team on the field is being outstripped and outpaced by teams' ability to extract value from the global financial transfer system. And that has negative incentive structures, which I think are bad. And they're also parasitic because, after all, the value that these, let's just say, this class of team, the biggest value of extractors of surplus in global soccer are, of course, these handful of teams that exist in the Champions League, but outside of the top five leagues. You guys know like who those teams are, obviously. And um, these teams are extracting value from the teams that are producing revenue, right? But then we can get into, well, why is it that these teams are able to produce the revenue and it's left to the Portuguese teams and so on to extract the surplus value from the financial system? Well, because they don't have access to the same revenue potential that these teams that they're extracting the value from do. So anyway, that's my little mini case for the Super League, the European Super League.
Nice. But actually, Ben, I'm curious what you think about this because, like, we have taught. So we've Matt as background. I don't know if you listen to the show, but we have spoken a lot about kind of the competing incentives of like we spoke about RSL, where like RSL had a great year and had an awesome team, and then they go and they sell Andres Gomez for a bomb, a huge fee, but also nuke their team in the process. And Ben, I'm kind of curious what you think, like where we have all these weird rule changes, and now like I feel like that's not gonna be a thing as much, where now I don't know what it is. Something about this window where like a lot of the good players moved intra-league makes me feel like there's going to be fewer teams that are going to nuke their season. And then also the thing we spoke about with Nikos, where like we spoke about the pending calendar shift, and Nico said like actually that's going to be a huge thing for teams sustaining championship runs where they are not put in a difficult decision in August, where like Manchester City comes and says, "Hey, we want your star player."
Hmm. No, I feel like the league is, I don't know, maybe this is giving the people running the league a little too much credit, but like I feel like they're trying to align the incentives around winning, around putting a good product on the field. Because you've been talking about how the league has been getting better, and I think that's undeniably true. Being a fan the past 5 years, year over year, the average player is getting way better. I don't know if the average team is increasing at the same rate. Like I don't know that the play on the field is necessarily as consistently good as the players on the field. If you have like I feel like this year, apart from like Miami and Columbus, have like everyone's like, oh, this is going to be the year where we have a really good shield race. Like six teams might be in the shield race. Well, that's because they're all letting points slip here and there. Like I think the incentives might be going a little bit more like, let's run off some championships. Like, let's have some big brands in this league. Like, we can't just be a league that people know because it's in the United States and because we have money to shell out to other leagues to bring players in from time to time. Like, we need to be a league of recognizable teams with recognizable players playing recognizably well. That's sort of where I think it is going and should be going more. Like these are not owners trying to make money on the transfer market necessarily. Like we have some of the richest owners in the world who own teams in MLS. So I feel like actually like pulling those resources towards winning and towards being a top five league is hopefully where it's going to be going. And I feel like these moves, they're aligning the resources a little more towards that without necessarily expanding the amount of resources teams need to spend to do it.
Well, and it's like largely MLS largely is like an asset equity growth play, depending when you got into the league. Like
Yeah.
I did some math once. Like if you take the original league owners and you give them, you have to do some like estimating on losses, on operating losses, but all of the expansion fees, they're net neutral before anything else, like after those. So, and that's assuming they all lost money. So it's a very weird thing, but I do agree with you. I think those incentive structures are definitely more aligning. I am, however, going to wrap us up here. Because we're running a little long, but I've had a lot of fun. Matt, I hope you've had fun. if you enjoy listening to the podcast, if you like ASA, if you're liking the articles that are coming out, season preview season is coming very, very shortly. Check out the Patreon. There's lots of tools in there. We built a squad builder, a trade machine. You can go through and see how Matt is optimizing his GAM derivatives. We've been talking about actually how that now that there's a cash market and a GAM market, we need a derivatives market in MLS somehow. That you're going to have GAM HSAs and FSAs, which has been quite fun. But it's one tier. It's $5 a month. It's a fun place to support the site. Matt, thank you so much. If somebody wants to reach out to you to contact you, if they have questions, if they want to talk about getting to where you are or whatever, what's the best place to reach you? LinkedIn?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn would be good. I do have a Twitter account, but I don't tweet in quite a long time.
Fair enough. All right, so Matthew Pfeffer on LinkedIn is going to be the best place to find him. Ben, thank you as always. Matt, thanks a bunch. We will be rooting as a member of Tier Zero, the Nerd Bus here. We will be rooting for the Rapids this year, and I'm sure Ben will be checking in. So thanks
From time
again.
to time.
Alrighty, as always, folks, enjoy the soccer.